century, the world was horrified as the Allied forces uncovered the Nazis' final solution. The final solution was Adolf Hitler's official policy to erase the entire Jewish race from the face of the earth. Between 1941 and 1945, around 6 million Jewish men, women, and children were murdered by the Nazi regime. The Holocaust, as it's become known, remains perhaps the most horrific event in Jewish history, and yet it is an event that was by no means unique to the Jewish people. Throughout history, there have been those who have sought to destroy the Jewish people. They have faced many threats to their existence. And the Old Testament book of Esther describes one of those times when the lives of Jewish men, women, and children were in grave danger. In Esther 3, we're introduced to a dangerous man called Haman. Haman plotted to kill the people of God. And as we look at this chapter where Ruth is notable by her absence, we will see as we look at this enemy, Haman, what he is like, what he did, then we'll also learn about the enemies of God's people today. Because doesn't Paul say that those who have believed as Abraham believed are the true seed of Abraham? And so what we learn here is not only something that is true of what we've seen in history with anti-Semitism, but certainly is true of what Christians experience today as nations, governments, and radical groups seek to wipe out Christianity. And so let's learn our enemy as we look at Haman. So Esther chapter 3, Haman, the Agagite, is introduced into the story. And the first thing I want you to notice is the enemy's character. The enemy's character in verses 1 to 6. Now, it's very significant that Haman is described as an Agagite. The Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, from the very first verse of this chapter. This alerts any reader who is familiar with the Old Testament to the fact that his appearance in this story is not good news. I'm told on reading this, there is a tradition of the congregation, the Jewish congregation, hissing and booing when his name is mentioned. He is not good news. He descended from King Agag of the Amalekites, that ancient enemy of God's people who challenged Moses after they came out of Egypt after God's great deliverance. And in fact, God had commanded the first king of Israel, King Saul, to kill Agag, to not just defeat him in battle, but to slaughter him and to wipe out all the remaining Amalekites. Now, we might be uncomfortable with that sort of language, but let's be clear about why God was commanding it. He was not commanding it based on a prejudice against their ethnicity, as many of these things today where you see evil people seeking to wipe out whole people groups. No, God was commanding the Amalekites to be wiped out as a judgment for their sin historically upon them. We must remember that God's judgment is always righteous, and they had done great evil in his sight. And he had prophesied many years before that they would receive just punishment for their sins. And so Saul was told to cut the head off the snake all those years ago. But what do we read? Saul disobeyed God. Saul allowed Agag to live. Saul did not pursue the Amalekites. And that meant the enemy lived to fight another day. That meant the appearance of Haman in Esther chapter 3. Now, having told us his family history, the narrative shows us what sort of man Haman was. And first of all, we see an incredibly arrogant man. Just look there at verses 1 to 4 again. Now, we're not told exactly when, and we're not told even why, but we read that King Ahasuerus, King Xerxes, decided to promote Haman above all his other officials, even giving him a throne which he could sit on. There is no one more powerful in the empire, the Persian Empire at this time, than Haman, except for King Ahasuerus. Haman, by the way, is not just mentioned biblically, he's mentioned in extra-biblical material going back to the Persian Empire. This is a real man. This was a political climber. This is someone who was of great significance in history. And yet it seems, I think the narrator is hinting to us that this is not a man who has got into his position by his upstanding character. Because after all, it's the king who commands the other officials who Haman has been promoted over to bow down. Anyone who is deserving of promotion doesn't need the king to say, you better bow down or else. Because you just have a reverence, a respect for him. But it seems there's no respect for Haman, and the officials are commanded to bow down whenever they see him coming. Surely, as we read the rest of this book, we will see evidence that Haman loved the admiration and veneration of others. He was power hungry, an arrogant man. He relished it when people bowed down to him. We only see that, we see that very clearly from his response when he sees that Mordecai doesn't. So he's an arrogant man, but we also see he was an angry man, verses 5 and 6. Because we do read that not everyone in Susa the citadel was very happy to obey Ahasuerus' command to honor Haman. Mordecai is marked out in the text as the only man, the only official in the king's gate who refused to bow down to the Agagite, even though he knew that Xerxes, Ahasuerus, was a very unpredictable man especially when he was disobeyed. Look what he did to his wife Vashti. Deposed her from the throne. And we see others pressuring Mordecai. In fact, the language that we see there in verse 5 of chapter 3 in verse 4 of chapter 3, is actually identical to the way that Potiphar's wife pressured Joseph day after day to lie with her. And Mordecai, just as Joseph resisted, resists this. He will not bow down to Haman. And when Haman sees this, he is filled with fury. A fury that is not only aimed at this one man, but just as Ahasuerus' anger with Vashti spilled over to the empire, this is going to spill over to all the Jews under the Persian rule. Verse 5 and 6, when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury, but he disdained to lay hands. That's interesting language, isn't it? He disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. The idea of just getting at Mordecai was abhorrent to him. So as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. Don't forget, by the way, Israel is still under Persian rule at this time. This is empire-wide. Every Jew is in trouble. And so why was it that Mordecai refused to bow down and pay homage to Haman? Doesn't the Bible tell us that we are to pay honor to those who are in positions higher than our own? Well, it could have been that Mordecai had seen Haman up close and personal. And he realized that this man was not worthy of this sort of position. He was not trustworthy. He had no integrity. And though he respected the office, he did not respect the man holding the office. Or perhaps as a Jew, he couldn't bring himself to honor someone who came from such a family as Haman did, an ancient enemy of the Jewish people. Perhaps he saw the intentions behind Haman's eyes. Or could it be bowing down to anyone other than God would simply violate his conscience as an Israelite? We're not told. We're not told. Just as we're not told why Daniel didn't eat from the king's table. We can speculate, but the scripture remains silent. But what we can conclude is this: whatever the reason, his actions were taken in order to honor God. And they marked him out as a Jew. That can be the only reasonable conclusion when Mordecai, asked by other officials, "Why haven't you bowed down?" tells them, "I'm a Jew." He was, whatever his reason, he was seeking to honor God. But it marked him out and put a deadly target on his back. In the same way, you and I should never be surprised when we seek to honor God that we are marked out and that targets are placed on us as Christians. The world will hate us when we seek to live according to God's standards and when we refuse the standards of the world. They will hate us. Just speak about how we are pro-life, not pro-choice. How a baby in the womb has a right to live as much as an infant outside the womb has a right to live. Or how someone at the end of their life has a right to dignity and care, and they are still valuable, and we should seek to care for them and provide that as much comfort for them, rather than give them a drug that will end their life. These things are not the world standards, and they hate us when we do. Just listen to the debates on euthanasia in the House of Commons and how MPs stood up and accused MPs who disagreed with the bill of being religious, and the scorn that they used that term with. But even on a micro level, you would rather go to church and work a shift on a Sunday? You won't come out drinking with us after work to the point of getting drunk? Our standards are not the world standards, and they will hate us when we seek to live in a way that honours God. But then, secondly, I want you to notice the enemy's cunning. in verses 7 to 11. The enemy's cunning. Now, when we read that Haman was filled with fury, we may expect his next steps to happen quickly. We may expect him to launch his attack on the Jewish people fast. After all, there was no one stopping him apart from King Ahasuerus, and King Ahasuerus was similarly hot-tempered. Surely he could be persuaded. No, Haman was more crafty and more calculated in his scheme than that. You see, he was patient. Look at verse 7. He realized that he needed not to jump in immediately with his plot, but wait for the opportune moment to put his plan into action. And in order to determine this, he didn't trust himself. He decided to let fate choose the exact date by casting lots, or as it's referred to in here, it's the Persian word pur. This whole book in Esther is telling us why the Jews celebrate the festival of Purim. And we'll see it stage by stage as we go along, that he casts the die. He casts lots, hoping that they will tell him what the date will be when he should launch his offensive against the Jewish people. Now, this was a common practice in the ancient world. In fact, it was so common that the Jews also adopted this practice. But there was a difference. Because the people of God, when they cast lots, they understood, as the book of Proverbs tells us, that though man throws the dice, it's God who determines where it lands. Haman did it with superstition, hoping for fate to overrule. But the Jews did it seeking the will of God, understanding that he's sovereign and he is in control of even the dice landing where they land. And the date is chosen. And this date gives Haman 1 year to prepare for the total annihilation of the Jewish people. He was patient. 1 year to prepare. And he was persuasive. Look at verses 8 to 11. Yes, Haman had power, but he knew that it would take more than simply going to the king and in a rage and telling him about that Mordecai who won't bow down to him. He needed to use persuasive words. What does he do? Well, we just look at his speech. How carefully crafted it is. How he subtly accuses the Jews of defiance in the kingdom. Chapter 3 and verse 8 to 11, we read this. There is a certain people scattered abroad. These immigrants. And dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. And their laws, their customs are different. Oh, we don't like different, do we? They are different from our customs, from the Persian customs, from every other people. They're just not integrating. They do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. They're harming your kingdom, not helping your kingdom. They're different from us. They're not one of us. But he doesn't tell him who immediately, does he? And then, well, that's not enough. He's got to flatter the king. Look what he says as we carry on reading in verses 8 and 11. He says, if it please the king. If it please the king. if you think it's a good thing, if you think this might be of benefit, only if you want to do this, let it be decreed, remember the laws of the Medes and Persians cannot be altered, that they be destroyed. Flattery will get you everywhere, especially if you put a bribe with it. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business. I'm going to lobby you, and I'm going to promise you profit. I'm going to, if flattery doesn't work, bribery will. Now, where's he going to get the money from? The Jews. You'll see that later on. We'll kill them, we'll plunder them. And his words work. Ahasuerus, he's not known in history as a particularly caring king. He responds, just look at his response just for a moment, verse 11. Forgive me for reading this with a bit of emphasis. The emphasis is all mine. The money is given to you. The people also do with them as it seems good to you. It's kind of like, shrug the shoulders. I'm not really bothered, Haman. Do what you want. He hasn't even asked who these certain people are. Because if he did, and he has a conversation with his wife, he might discover something he doesn't like. He will discover it, but spoilers. He gives Haman the authority and the money to do whatever he wants. He gives him a budget. And he gives him the authority and power over the people to do exactly what he wants to do. Brothers and sisters, we need to realize that the attacks of our enemy will rarely begin with open hostility or violence. In some of the most violent countries where Christians live today, their attacks did not begin with open hostility. Attacks did not begin with violence. They began with words. It often begins with accusations of God's people not fitting in with social norms. It begins with calling our moral standards outdated, not in step with the modern culture, disobedient to the laws of the land, not helpful but a hindrance to progress. And we shouldn't be surprised that our enemies may even use political power and legislation to attack us. And when we see this happening, we should know that it won't take long for violence to follow. We should never think, because we have a heritage of Christianity in this country, that we are never vulnerable to real persecution taking place in future years. It may not be here now, but as we see, it only takes the wrong people in the right place at the right time, who know how to use their power. And so let's be thankful for groups like the Christian Institute or Christian Concern or CARE, who watch over places of power and who lobby in favour of Christian values. But let me also say this, because our enemy has historically and presently in other places in the world done this to God's people, and we are familiar with his schemes, we should also be concerned and stand up when it's done to others who are not one of us. because we see these schemes done not only to God's people, but to others too, and it should concern us when we hear the language of Haman used about any other people group. This country has been built on a tolerance for people who are different to us in convictions, even religious convictions, because of Baptists and nonconformists. Let's not lose sense of history. But then lastly, I want you to see the enemy's callousness in verses 12 to 15. The enemy's callousness. Because here we see Haman reach the peak of his power. He takes the first steps of his plan. He makes an edict, verse 12 to 14. We're told that on the 13th day of the first month, that is the Jewish month of Nisan, an edict is made. The king's scribes are gathered to record the order that every Jew in Persia should be killed. It's written in every language. It's distributed to every governor in every province of the empire. It is interesting, and the commentators do note that these verses seem completely void of any emotion. There's no one saying, no, stop this. There's no one questioning. Haman's rage seems to have disappeared into the background. This is just the wheels of government turning. It's all very callous. But then we see the effect of this edict go out in verse 15. As it's publicly published, we realize Haman is not riding the waves of public opinion. This is a personal vendetta. This is an ancient vendetta, but it's a personal vendetta. But not everyone feels the same. The people of Susa are utterly confused. They don't understand why this is happening. They don't seem to have a problem with the Jews. They don't seem to have an issue with them living among them. But look in contrast. Where's Haman? Sitting with the king, drinking wine. An edict for the annihilation, the slaughter, the murder of every Jewish man, woman, boy, and girl has just been published, and Haman sits and drinks with the king. What a picture of callous evil, if we ever did see one. But listen, don't fail to notice the timing of Haman's edict. The 13th day of the month of Nisan. What's significant about that? While this edict was being published, Jews across the empire were preparing for tomorrow. And tomorrow is the Passover. And what do they remember at Passover? The deliverance of God when they were slaves in Egypt and their babies were being thrown into the Nile. God came and rescued them with the blood of a lamb. God isn't mentioned in this book, but his fingerprints are all over it. And there's an important lesson for us to learn here. When we face opposition, brothers and sisters, when we are confronted with insurmountable circumstances, when it looks like the church cannot win, we should then never, ever lose hope. But instead, we need to look back. We need to look back to the greatest deliverance of all, not the Passover. For the Jews at this time living in Susa and across the Persian Empire, they look back to a great delivery, the peak delivery of the Old Testament, the exodus from Egypt when God revealed his hand against Pharaoh and rescued them and brought them into their own promised land. And they remember that time while they are once again living in a foreign land under foreign rule, which is an oppressive rule. And their lives are in danger. No, we look back to a greater delivery than even the Passover. We must look back to the delivery when the Passover lamb, the Lord Jesus Christ, came into this world and gave his life on a cross, taking the punishment for our sin so that we could be rescued from sin and Satan and death and hell. And so when we face those insurmountable odds, when everything looks like it's against the church and it looks like the church's very existence is on the line, what do? We look back and we say, God has delivered us in a far greater way in the past, and so even from this he will deliver us again. If God has delivered us from our greatest enemy, from our greatest danger, then God will deliver us from all other dangers which pale in significance compared to an eternity without him. Now, before we finish, we need to notice something else that God's doing in the story of Esther 3. We would be wrong to think that this is a battle simply between Haman and Mordecai for the Jews. It's more. We've already seen Haman is a descendant of Agag, the Amalekite. But I want you to also know something I've deliberately kept from you. We need to know that Mordecai was a Benjaminite. And who else was a Benjaminite? Call it out. Saul. Where Saul failed, God gives Mordecai to succeed. It's no coincidence, is it, Kramer? Wow! It's no coincidence. God's not mentioned in the book, but his fingerprints are all over it. Just like in your life, there are times when you think, where is God? And if you look hard enough, or maybe ask another Christian, there's evidence of his fingerprints. And if you can't see it now, you'll see it one day. It's no coincidence that this Benjaminite finds himself in Susa at the exact same time as an Agagite. And if Haman is successful, in fact, this is not even just a battle between Mordecai and Haman. Let me back up a little bit. This is also a battle not only over the existence of the Jews, but this is a battle for the promises of God to Israel. If Haman is successful in wiping out the Jews, then who doesn't come into the world? The seed of Abraham, Jesus Christ. Mordecai is right when he says to Esther in chapter 4 next week, perhaps it's for such a time as this that God has put you here. This is not a battle between Mordecai and Haman for the Jews. This is a battle for the promised seed. It's a battle that God will use for his glory and his praise and his honor among all the nations of the world. Christian, trust him. Trust him for every other battle, which is small in comparison to the battle he has already won. in his Son, the Lord Jesus. Amen.